Wisconsin, Milwaukee County.
And would you please introduce yourselves?
Good morning. My name is Honore Alexander, and we are Amador Valley High School's Unit 6, representing the Golden State of California. We would like to thank you all for listening to our testimony today.
Good morning. My name is Lois Hong.
Good morning. My name is Margaret Huai.
Good morning. My name is Jasmine Chen. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to listen to us today. And I'd also like to thank our teacher coach, Ms. Sklar, and our timer and facilitator, Ms. Yaron Groth.
Well, welcome. As you know, we're doing Unit 6, what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century. And we're doing question number 1. Quote, disband your deluded followers. Should you attempt to fire upon the troops of government, the consequences might be fatal to many of your men, the least guilty. What useful purposes, if any, have rebellions served throughout American history? Do the events of January 6, 2021 at the U.S. Capitol constitute a rebellion? Why or why not? Are there rebellions in the world today that are justified? Why or why not? You may begin.
The American Revolution began as a rebellion, and in the Civil War, the Southern states rebelled against the Union. Rebellion is ingrained in American history. As a unit, we define rebellion to be an open resistance against an established authority under a collective goal. Throughout United States history, the effects of rebellion have rippled beyond rebels and their cause, highlighting fundamental wrongs and systemic injustices.
First, rebellions have highlighted critical weaknesses in our government institutions. In 1789, Shays' Rebellion rose in reaction to high taxes and poor economic conditions. Even though the rebellion itself was eventually put down by private personal militias, it exposed how weak the federal government was under the Articles of Confederation, since the government could not raise an army. Shays' Rebellion shed light upon a fundamental government flaw and eventually led to great change through the writing of the Constitution.
On the other hand, despite bringing attention to the injustices at hand, rebellions against social institutions have at times actually harmed the goal of the rebels. In the German Coast Uprising of 1811, Charles Deslandes and 24 other slaves attacked the plantation owner and his family. In response, approximately 100 slaves were executed and publicly displayed. Due to the slaves' violent rebellion, their oppressors saw them as violent and dangerous, using the insurgents as a warning for future slave rebels and harming the abolition movement.
The events of January 6, 2021 did constitute a rebellion. At the March for Trump rally, prior to instructing his audience to head towards the Capitol, former President Trump declared, "All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen. If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." January 6 constituted a rebellion against the established authority of not only the Electoral College, but also the legitimacy of the Democratic Republic as a whole, with the collective goal of overturning a factually legitimate election.
In addition to being a rebellion, January 6th is also an insurrection. Under the Insurrection Act of 1807, insurrections oppose or obstruct the execution of the laws of the United States or impede the course of justice under those laws. Congressional activities, including fulfilling the constitutional duty of certifying electoral votes, would qualify as an execution of the laws of the United States. Thus, by disrupting Congress's certification of the election results, the January 6 participants engaged in insurrection.
Although January 6 was a rebellion, it wasn't necessarily a justified one. To determine whether or not a rebellion is justified, we look towards Hobbes' 1651 work, Leviathan, in which he held that a subject could rightly resist government as a matter of self-defense, and when the perpetration of lethal harm was imminent. Under this definition, we believe that there are rebellions in the world today that are justified. On January 21st of 2021, the Taliban announced that its security forces had killed 8 resistance fighters and seized their munitions. The anti-Taliban rebellions in Afghanistan were justified because the Taliban demonstrated a lethal threat towards the Afghan resistance.
Furthermore, beyond physical violence, we believe that rebellions are justified against structural violence, violence against the people through the social contract and government institutions. In the aftermath of their 2020 democratic elections, Myanmar's military occupation forced themselves into power, thus adjusting their social contract without the consent of the governed. In Myanmar, citizens are opposing the military's coup d'etat. The military initiated structural violence against the Myanmar peoples, which justifies their rebellion against this military rule.
From the pre-revolutionary era through the civil rights movement, rebellions are ingrained in American history, highlighting systemic injustices and raising fundamental change. Today, rebellions continue to shape our nation, as well as nations beyond our borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As you might guess, we've got some follow-up questions for you. Take the position of the most violent January 6th demonstrators and tell us how you think they might justify their behavior to their children and grandchildren.
A way that insurrectionists might justify their behavior to themselves and also future generations is by explaining that they've already went through all legal means available to them. For example, the Trump administration and his political allies incited over 60 lawsuits in 30 different states, and each and every one of these lawsuits were struck down by the courts involved in these decisions because there was a lack of factual standing supporting their claims of election fraud in the 2020 presidential election. Since they already tried to have their voices properly addressed by courts, they have no other recourse to having these claims heard other than going to Capitol Hill and engaging in insurrection like they did on January 6th.
Furthermore, they could also argue that from their point of view, the election was in fact fraudulent, and people who are saying they aren't on the internet are simply censoring their point of view. For example, following the election, Facebook, according to studies from ProPublica and the Washington Post, over 650,000 posts on Facebook were hosting the election as fraudulent and as illegitimate. Due to these echo chambers on social media and gatherings of groups of misinformation, they could have truly believed in their hearts that the election was in fact wrong.
However, the whole idea of self-justifying a rebellion is inherently flawed because your own perception is going to be biased as to what the actual events are. And so this is an idea called, coined by John Rawls, the idea of the veil of ignorance, that you can only make objective decisions and decide things objectively once you take you and your opinions completely out of the situation and look at the context as a whole. And so if somebody was justifying this based off of their own beliefs, then under this idea, it wouldn't be justified. But if they're looking at it at a context of the whole, then it would.
Interesting. Good. Steve, do you want me to ask the next question?
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Do you think Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is implicated as a result of this event? And why?
So I believe that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is implicated for senators who have been involved. However, if we look one step further and we look at the President Donald Trump, there are debates as to whether he should be held liable to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But if we look back to the founding of the 14th Amendment, Senator Howard of Michigan, Republican senator, actually assumed that all presidents in the future would have had to hold a public office in the past. And so they would all inherently be liable to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. However, we see with President Donald Trump that this is sort of an anomaly. He's one of the only presidents to not hold a public office and also to be involved in something that would implicate this. So if we look at the founders' sort of view, then yes, Donald Trump would be implicated.
And in the other branches of government, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is also playing a role. For example, we can see people beginning to question Justice Clarence Thomas's roles in the January 6th hearings and in the area as a whole due to his wife, Ginny Thomas's involvement in the insurrection. So Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is involved in not only the executive branch, but also the others as well.
Well, how about Congress? Do you all know anything about what's going on about congressional lawsuits?
Right. So the issue of executive privilege, subpoenas, and congressional investigations is also very controversial, specifically because Steve Bannon has been held in criminal contempt for refusing to comply to the subpoena because he claims executive privilege. However, if we look at the nitty-gritty and the facts, Steve Bannon really has no standing to claim executive privilege. This is because he's already retired. And in order for somebody to be retired to claim executive privilege, the incumbent president has to give them authorization. And so
thank you for, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's not what my question was. And I want there to be opportunity for other questions to be asked. I was asking about the implication of Section 3 with regard to sitting congressmen. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. So Lindsay, why don't you go ahead?
So I want to go back to your definition of rebellion. And I specifically would like to ask you, being from California, there was a time back when I was roughly your age that the Black Panther Party decided that because their observation of how government, and particularly law enforcement, dealt with members of the Black community, that they should go openly armed and would walk through the community. Would that constitute a rebellion? And would it be, given your definition, the kind of thing for which government should have a response?
So looking towards the message to the grassroots speech that Malcolm X once said, he stated that revolution is based on land, and there is no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. However, our unit stated that we must exhaust all nonviolent means before going to violent means. With the Black Panthers movement, they did happen to use all nonviolent means. However, the government was still not listening. So in this case, we see that this is in fact justified for them to go open arms.
And at the same time, the whole issue of police brutality essentially necessitates rebellion. In Henry Thoreau's 1859 essay on civil disobedience, he talks about how rebellion and violence are justified if the issues cause an unbearable tyranny and cannot be fixed through the legal system. When considering the fact that African Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be killed in police-related incidents, and that all attempts at pursuing litigation to fix this are stopped at the idea of qualified immunity, we see how this sort of tyrannical effect can't be solved through peaceful means. So this rebellion would be justified.
To answer the second part of your question, there could be a possible government response that the Black Panthers movement warrants. For example, in 1934, California Governor Merriam initiated martial law in San Francisco's docks when there was a dock workers strike there. This had the effect of being able to deploy the National Guardsmen to ensure economic security and a transition back to peace in that area. If the Black Panthers movement or any similar movement posed such a significant threat to national security and well-being, then it would be justified for the government to impose martial law.
So, accepting for just a moment that you just gave me an answer that was appropriate for the 1960s and 70s, does the result of the George Floyd trial, where there was a conviction of an officer, say that maybe there was a change and that kind of behavior would not be appropriate anymore?
I think there is a level to which there has been a change of social thought over the time, and also a change of how strictly we are looking upon our police officers. However, at the same time, it's not necessarily that this change is all encompassing. And as we can see through other protests that have occurred for people like Breonna Taylor and other victims of police brutality, there is still a pattern of unfair justice throughout the systems. And so I would say it's not true that these actions aren't justified, especially if we align with Martin Luther King's idea of justice delayed is justice denied. Over the years, we've seen that there are still injustices that are not being fully clamped down on.
Additionally, there is still an imbalance in justice since there's different levels of recognition of how far police brutality against African Americans have gone in America. For example, with the 2020 Portland Back the Blue rally, there was a violent clash between pro-Black Lives Matter movement protesters and pro-police officer protesters. This shows how there's still violence and significant divisions in America on the issue of police brutality, when there should be more full recognition of how systemic racism is embedded within police brutality.
Okay, thank you.
Under what conditions do the public have the right to abolish or to alter government?
The public has a right to alter government when there has been a long train of abuses that the government has enacted upon them. This is an idea expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, along with a lot of other foundational philosophical documents. When the government is continuously unjustly denying rights of citizens or acting against their common good and common interest, the people do have a right to alter their government.
However, we must note that it's not justified in times where it's just a simple mismanagement of government. And so, for example, in John Locke's second treatise on government, he delegates that there is an inherent right to revolution. However, it's important to note that right to revolution is only for serious topics that cannot be fixed through the legal system. And so if it's an issue that's just simply deemed as a friction of the machine of government, then it would not be justified for the people to take arms and try and change the government forcefully instead of trying peaceful means.
Great. Well, is it time?
It's time, yes.
Oh,
Okay.
heavens.
Well,
And that was 10 minutes. That's astonishing. Wonderful.
thank you all very, very much. A little feedback, good to define your terms. That was helpful to get on the kick, the start out of the whole process. You had a lot of good background historical information you built in. I would like to see a little bit more in terms of the constitutional application, but you gave us some real meat to think about.
Lindsay, do you want to go or shall I?
Okay, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Part of the reason I asked the Black Panther question had to do with trying to see how consistent you were going to be given a topic that came out of somewhere else. And I was very much impressed that even though I think there are a number of people who would argue very much with the position that you took, it was a very consistent position. And that to me is what you acquitted yourself quite well with that. I also liked the fact that when I tried to push you in a specific direction, you said, did you forget about Breonna Taylor? And I very much said, okay, they really do see that this is not a single direction focus. Let me stop. Excellent. Congratulations, your teacher, you did a great job.
I thought so too. That was a really lovely job and very interesting. And I agree that your presentation was clear and straightforward and made a nice essay that worked. And what's nice to see is that you provided just as much in the answers to the questions that we asked that I didn't even notice that a minute was due, much less that we were finished. I particularly like the veil of ignorance and your Thoreau unbearable tyranny references. And I'm sorry to have cut you off. I just wanted to be sure that we had a chance for other people to ask their questions. I hope you didn't think that was too rude. The point that I've been going for was that there are at least 4 lawsuits brought against congressmen for being involved in the insurrection, arguing that they cannot run again for office. And I believe that the 3 Arizona cases were dismissed, and there's pending in Georgia whether or not Marjorie Taylor Greene still can be decided. And that's what I was going for. So I'm sorry, I just figured that was often in another direction. But I think you did a really stunning job. And I just hope that you've really enjoyed this experience, because we need you not just to be excellent citizens, but with people of your caliber and experience, we need you to be our representatives in the future, whether it's local or state or federal government. There are many, many positions in the government, elected or not, that could use your understanding of what the government is supposed to do. And if any of you find that you have some interest in that, I'll tell you, I'll be sleeping a whole lot better when I'm sitting in my nursing home. So thank you. It was lovely to hear how well your generation is doing with this experience. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you very much.